Imagine a world where the vast majority of species on Earth just vanish, gone, in what feels like the blink of a geological eye.
It really does sound like something out of science fiction, doesn't it?
It absolutely
Yeah.
does. But this isn't fantasy. It's a recurring chapter in our planet's actual history.
Mm-hmm.
So today we're taking a deep dive into these truly cataclysmic moments, mass extinction events. You've set us a fantastic stack of sources, articles, research papers, your notes, laying out the science behind these planetary resets.
Yeah, and what's really striking, looking through all this material, is how it lets us piece together a clear geological story.
Right?
We're not just seeing what happened, the extinctions themselves, but the profound how and maybe most importantly, why these ancient events hold such vital lessons for us right now.
Okay, so that's our mission for you, the listener. We want to pull out the most important insights from all this rich material you sent. We'll journey back, way back into Earth's deep past.
Looking at the quote-unquote Big Five.
Exactly, the Big Five mass extinctions. We'll try to understand their unique causes, their consequences, and then, crucially, we'll bring it forward to the present.
To see if maybe, just maybe, we're living through a new one.
A new, perhaps equally profound crisis, but one driven by something very different. Get ready for some really surprising facts, I think, and maybe a few aha moments about life, resilience, and change on Earth. All right, so to kick things off, let's nail down the basics. What exactly is a mass extinction? The phrase sounds incredibly dramatic, obviously, but what's the precise scientific definition? What makes it different from just, normal species disappearing over time?
That's a great starting point. Okay, so formally, a mass extinction is defined as a relatively brief interval in Earth's history. Brief geologically speaking, of course.
Right, could still be thousands or millions of years to us.
Exactly. But in geological terms, it's short. And during this interval, the rate at which species are lost just skyrockets. It vastly exceeds the normal kind of background rate of extinction that's always happening.
Okay, so it's about the speed and the scale.
Precisely. And to really qualify as one of the major mass extinction events, the loss has to be truly catastrophic. We're talking generally over 75% of all estimated species vanishing. 75% or more.
Wow.
And another key point, these events have to be global. They affect a huge range of organisms across all sorts of different ecosystems, land, sea, everywhere. It's not just, one particular region having a bad time.
Okay, so global catastrophic loss, way above the normal background rate. Can you give us an example? Like what vanished?
Well, think about iconic examples. The disappearance of the trilobites, those amazing armored arthropods at the end of the Permian period. They were around for hundreds of millions of years, then boom, gone.
Okay.
Or, of course, the most famous one, the non-avian dinosaurs, vanishing at the end of the Cretaceous. Those are really definitive examples of this immense scale of loss.
75%.
Yeah.
That number is it's hard to wrap your head around that much biodiversity just gone.
It really is.
Now, our sources talk a lot about this framework, the Big Five. Could you walk us through those and also maybe touch on the nuance? Because I gather it's not quite as simple as just these five and nothing else mattered.
That's a really key point. Yeah. So for the Phanerozoic eon, that's the last, let's say, 541 million years or so. Basically the time when we have abundant, diverse animal life leaving fossils.
Right, the time we can really study in detail.
Exactly. Within that vast stretch of time, scientists consistently identify 5 exceptionally severe events. These are the end Ordovician, the late Devonian, the end Permian, that's the really big one, the Great Dying.
We'll definitely get to that one.
Yeah. Then the end Triassic, and finally the end Cretaceous, the dinosaur killer. These 5 were indeed the most devastating, so they provide a really useful framework for studying these crises.
Okay, so they're the worst of the worst.
They are. And this is the nuance. You mentioned statistical analysis of the fossil record. Looking at extinction rates over time shows that these 5 are really just the highest, most catastrophic peaks on a whole continuum of extinction crises.
Ah, okay. So there were other bad periods, too.
Definitely. There were numerous, let's call them minor mass extinctions that were still incredibly devastating for specific groups or regions. Something like the end Capitanian event, which happened before the end Permian, was a major crisis in its own right.
Right.
And we can even look back further, before the Phanerozoic, before complex animals really took off. Events like the Great Oxidation Event billions of years ago caused mass extinction among early microbial life. So extinction, even on a planetary scale, seems to be a recurring pattern in Earth's deep history.
So these Big Five are the peaks, the major resets. But life has faced serious challenges many other times too. Given the sheer scale we're talking about, how do scientists even begin to understand the mechanisms?
Yeah.
Is there like a common pattern, a model for how these mega disasters unfold?
There is, actually, and it's a really crucial concept that comes up again and again in the sources. It's often called the press pulse model. Yeah, the basic idea is that a full-scale mass extinction, one of these really big ones, typically requires two types of causes acting together, often in sequence.
Two types, like what?
First, there's what's called a long-term environmental press. Think of this as a gradual, sustained stressor that weakens ecosystems over a long time. It reduces their resilience, makes them fragile.
Okay, like maybe slow climate change or habitats gradually disappearing.
Exactly, things like that. It puts everything under strain. Then, while the system is weakened by this press, along comes a sudden, catastrophic pulse.
The final blow.
Precisely. This delivers the final lethal blow. It could be something really dramatic and sudden, like a massive volcanic eruption releasing tons of gas quickly, or, the classic asteroid impact.
Okay, so it's not usually just one thing, but this deadly combination. I like the analogy in the notes. It's like a patient whose health has been slowly getting worse because of a chronic illness. And then they suddenly get hit with a really severe infection. That infection might not have been fatal to a healthy person, but it completely overwhelms the already weakened system.
That's a perfect analogy. The long-term press makes the ecosystem incredibly vulnerable, so when the sudden pulse hits, the consequences are far more devastating than they might have been otherwise.
So without that underlying stress, maybe a big volcanic eruption would just cause, I don't know, a major ecosystem shakeup, but not necessarily wipe out 75% of everything.
That seems to be the pattern, yeah. It often takes that combination. But what's really fascinating, and maybe a bit counterintuitive at first, is that these events, these moments of almost unimaginable destruction, they aren't just about death and loss, are they?
Right. The notes mention this dual nature, destruction, but also creation.
Exactly. From global death comes the opportunity for planetary rebirth. It sounds almost poetic, but it's a fundamental aspect of how life evolves on the grand scale.
That is a profound thought. How does that work?
Well, mass extinctions are not solely stories of devastation. They are also primary engines, maybe the primary engines, of large-scale evolutionary innovation.
So.
By clearing out established ecological niches, wiping out the dominant species that have held those roles for millions of years, they create these incredible, unparalleled opportunities for the lineages that manage to survive.
Okay. So the survivors suddenly have less competition, empty spaces to move into.
Precisely. They can diversify, evolve new forms, fill those vacated roles. The classic example, which comes up again and again, is the rise of mammals.
Right, after the dinosaurs went extinct.
Exactly. For something like 150 million years, mammals were mostly small, nocturnal, living in the shadows of the dinosaurs. But after the end Cretaceous extinction wiped out the non-avian dinosaurs.
Boom. Their chance.
They radiated explosively, diversifying into all sorts of forms, eventually becoming the dominant large animals on Earth. It shows that life's greatest tragedies, geologically speaking, are also its greatest opportunities for fundamental change. Although it's crucial to remember that change happens on timescales that are almost impossible for us to truly comprehend.
It really is an incredible thought devastation leading to innovation on such a massive scale. Okay, let's dive into the details of the Big Five, starting way back in the Paleozoic era. These are some truly ancient calamities. First up, the End-Ordovician mass extinction. This was around, 445 million years ago?
That's right, yeah. Roughly 445 million years back.
And the description is a world plunged into ice. What was the planet like back then? What set the stage for an ice-driven crisis?
Okay, so the Ordovician period itself, which came before the extinction, was actually a really vibrant time. It followed the Cambrian explosion, and it saw another huge burst of life called the Great Ordovician Biodiversification Event.
So life was booming.
Absolutely booming, especially in the oceans. The Earth itself was very much a greenhouse planet back then. High CO2 levels in the atmosphere, warmer global temperatures, and because of that, sea levels were significantly higher than today.
Higher seas?
Yeah.
What did that mean for the continents?
Well, most of the landmass was clumped together in a supercontinent called Gondwana. Think future South America, Africa, India, Australia, Antarctica, all joined up.
You're right.
And complex life hadn't really colonized land yet. beyond maybe some very primitive mosses or spores. So the continents were mostly barren rock, but those high sea levels flooded vast portions of Gondwana, creating these extensive, warm, shallow seas right on top of the continental crust. We call them epicontinental seas.
Oh, like huge inland seas.
Exactly. And these were the nurseries where life truly flourished. They were teeming with an incredible diversity of invertebrates, trilobites, shelled creatures called brachiopods, bryozoans, which are like lacy coral structures, early actual corals, plankton, just incredible diversity.
Sounds idyllic. But you mentioned Gondwana.
Right. Gondwana wasn't stationary. It was slowly, inexorably drifting southwards. And as this massive continent moved, it was setting the stage, unknowingly, for a global catastrophe. It was drifting towards the South Pole.
A drifting continent causing catastrophe that's dramatic. So how did this warm, shallow paradise turn into an ice-driven crisis? What were the actual causal mechanisms here?
Well, this extinction, the Andor division, is kind of unique among the Big Five because it seems to have been primarily a crisis born of ice, and it came as a sort of 1-2 punch.
Okay, punch one.
Punch one was the rapid onset of a major ice age. As Gondwana drifted over the South Pole, massive continental ice sheets started to form on it. This locked up enormous volumes of water, pulling it out of the oceans.
Ah, so sea levels dropped.
Dramatically, catastrophically.
Yeah.
Estimates range from a drop of 50 to maybe even 100 meters.
Wow, that would drain those shallow seas completely.
Almost entirely. For the marine organisms living in those widespread epicontinental seas, this was devastating. Their primary habitat, the most species-rich environment on the planet, effectively vanished. And at the same time, the whole planet plunged into a cold snap, which was a huge shock to all the life that had adapted to those stable, warm greenhouse conditions.
Okay, so a sudden ice age, habitats destroyed, massive cooling. That's punch one. What was the second pulse?
The second pulse, the second punch, happened as that brief but intense ice age ended. The glaciers started to melt rapidly, releasing huge volumes of fresh water back into the oceans.
So sea levels rose again. Sounds like good news.
You'd think so, but no. As the sea levels rose rapidly, the waters flooding back onto the continental shelves were actually cold, and crucially, they were oxygen-poor anoxic because they came from the deep ocean, which had stagnated.
Oh, so suffocating waters.
Oh, exactly. These anoxic waters flooded the shelves, suffocating the surviving bottom-dwelling communities that had maybe weathered the initial cold snap. And there's also pretty strong evidence suggesting these deep waters were enriched with toxic heavy metals like mercury, possibly from volcanic activity, which further poisoned the recovering ecosystems.
So first it gets cold and dry, then it gets flooded with cold, toxic, oxygen-poor water. That is a brutal double whammy.
Absolutely lethal for a huge percentage of marine life.
What caused this huge climate flip-flop? The sudden cooling, then warming. What's the main suspect, the whodunit here?
It's still debated, like a lot of these deep-time events, but there are some leading hypotheses. One strong contender points to a significant drop in atmospheric CO2.
Okay, how would that happen?
Possibly through enhanced silicate weathering. This is a natural process where chemical reactions between rainwater, CO2, and exposed rock actually draw CO2 out of the atmosphere and lock it away in carbonate rocks.
Like rocks scrubbing the air.
Kind of, yeah. And factors that could have boosted this weathering include the uplift of large mountain ranges, like the early Appalachians exposing lots of fresh rock, and maybe, just maybe, the emergence of the very first primitive land plants might have biologically accelerated this process too, pulling down CO2.
Interesting. Plants causing cooling.
Potentially contributing, yeah. Another major hypothesis involves large-scale volcanism. Now, usually we associate volcanoes with warming via CO2,
Right.
but sustained eruptions can also blast huge amounts of sulfur dioxide aerosols high into the atmosphere. These aerosols reflect sunlight and can cause significant short-term cooling. Volcanic ash falling into the oceans could also fertilize them, triggering algal blooms.
And the blooms die and rot.
Consuming oxygen, leading to anoxia, and also drawing down CO2 as they sink. So volcanism could, paradoxically, contribute to both cooling and anoxia.
Complex feedback loops.
Very. And there's even a more, let's say, exotic theory involving a nearby gamma ray burst from space. The idea is it could have stripped Earth's ozone layer, bathing the surface in lethal UV radiation, and also created nitrogen dioxide aerosols that caused rapid cooling. But that one's still pretty speculative.
Okay, so a mix of Earth-based processes, maybe even a cosmic influence. What was the final body count, the toll on life?
This event ranks as the second largest mass extinction of the Phanerozoic eon in terms of percentage loss. It wiped out an estimated 85% of all marine species.
85%.
Yeah, and a huge chunk of marine genera too, maybe 50–60%. And since complex life hadn't really conquered land yet, this was an exclusively marine catastrophe.
Who got hit the hardest?
The shallow water, bottom-dwelling communities, groups like the brachiopods and the bryozoans were absolutely decimated. Many types of trilobites suffered immense losses, some entire groups vanished. Even the early reef systems built by corals and sponges were hit very hard. And in the water column, the planktonic graptolites, which were these tiny colonial animals, came perilously close to complete annihilation.
Was it selective? Did certain types do worse than others?
Very much so, and the two pulses hit different groups. The first pulse, the cooling and sea level drop, disproportionately affected species adapted to warm tropical waters, especially those with narrow geographic ranges. They just had nowhere to go.
Makes sense.
Then the second pulse, the rapid warming and spread of anoxic waters, killed off many of the cool water species that might have briefly thrived or survived during the glacial period. It was a filter that removed specialists at both ends of the temperature spectrum.
And what did the world look like afterwards? What was the recovery like?
Well, compared to some of the later big extinctions, the recovery in the early Silurian period was relatively rapid, geologically speaking. But the ecology was significantly changed. One of the biggest shifts was a breakdown of the strong regional differences, the provinciality that characterized Ordovician life.
Ah, so faunas became more similar everywhere.
Exactly. Those distinct local faunas were largely replaced by more uniform, widespread assemblages composed of generalist species survivors that could tolerate a wider range of conditions. Think ecological homogenization.
Did any new groups rise up?
It wasn't a time of radical new body plans appearing, but it did clear ecological space. Some groups of articulate brachiopods that were less affected radiated and became very dominant on Silurian seafloors. And some scientists argue that this extinction was a key event that, by removing many dominant invertebrate groups, cleared the way for the later diversification of jawed fishes.
The ones that would dominate the next period? The Devonian.
Precisely. So it reshuffled the deck, even if it didn't invent a whole new game immediately.
Okay, so the big takeaway from the Ordovician seems to be that even without giant asteroids or planet-covering lava flows, Earth's own climate system, particularly shifts in and out of ice ages and the resulting changes in sea level and ocean oxygen, can trigger mass extinction.
Absolutely. It's a powerful reminder of how sensitive life is to the planet's internal geological and climatic processes.
Right. Okay, moving on from the Ordovician Ice Age, let's jump forward in time to the late Devonian extinctions. These happened roughly between 372 and 359 million years ago. And the sources describe this one differently, as a more protracted crisis, a long, drawn-out affair stemming from changes happening on both land and sea. What was the world like before this crisis hit?
The Devonian period is fascinating. It was a time of truly immense evolutionary innovation, really transformative changes. In the oceans, it's famously known as the Age of Fishes.
Oh, it's just fishes, okay.
Yeah, jawed vertebrates, fish with jaws, underwent this spectacular radiation. The seas were dominated by incredibly diverse groups, especially the placoderms. These were armored fish, some of them enormous apex predators, like the truly formidable Dunkleostis.
Oh yeah, I've seen pictures of that one. Looks terrifying. Like an armored tank with giant shearing jaws.
Exactly. Could grow larger than a modern great white shark. Alongside them, you had early sharks diversifying lobe-finned fish, the group that would eventually give rise to land vertebrates, and the ancestors of modern ray-fin fish, the group that includes most fish alive today. The oceans were bustling.
And on land, you mentioned changes there too. This was when plants really took off, right? The first forests.
Absolutely. An equally profound revolution was happening on the continents. It's sometimes called the greening of the land. Plants, which in the previous period, the Silurian, were still relatively small and mostly confined to damp areas near water, evolved really key innovations in the Devonian.
Like what?
Things like vascular tissue plumbing to transport water and nutrients, allowing them to grow tall, and crucially, deep, complex root systems to anchor themselves and extract resources from the soil. This allowed plants to conquer drier land and form the planet's first true forests, dominated by trees like Archaeopteris.
Wow, the first forests. That must have changed the landscape completely.
Totally. And meanwhile, back in the tropical seas, life was incredibly abundant. You had massive, complex reef systems, but not built by the corals we know today. These were constructed mainly by organisms called stromatoporoid sponges, along with extinct groups of corals known as tabulate and rugose corals. It was really vibrant world, buzzing with life, but maybe one that was unknowingly heading towards ecological instability because of all these rapid changes.
Okay, a world of giant fish, the first forests, bustling reefs. Sounds amazing. But then came the crisis, and the sources emphasized this wasn't a single sudden event like maybe the Ordovician punches felt like. It was a multi-pulse extinction. Can you explain that?
Yeah, that's a key feature of the late Devonian event. Unlike, say, an asteroid impact, which is instantaneous geologically, this extinction was a prolonged biotic crisis. It unfolded in a series of pulses, or steps, over several million years, mainly during the latter half of the Devonian period.
Several million years, that's a long time for an extinction event.
It is, and it makes it one of the most complex and challenging extinctions to fully understand. While there were likely several smaller extinction pulses, the crisis is often defined by two main severe events. The Kelbasser event, which happened around 372 million years ago, right at the boundary between the Frasnian and Famennian stages of the Devonian. That was probably the most significant blow.
Correct, Kelbasser.
And then the Hangenberg event, which occurred right at the very end of the Devonian period, around 359 million years ago. This seems to have been the final killing blow for many groups that had survived Kelbasser. This protracted, multi-step nature strongly suggests it wasn't caused by a single trigger, but rather a complex interplay of Earth system stresses building up over time.
Right. Not a single killer, but multiple interacting stressors piling up. A real geological whodunit, as the notes put it. So what were the leading suspects? What drove this long crisis?
Well, the evidence points towards a cascade of interconnected environmental changes. And intriguingly, many scientists believe these changes were ultimately triggered by those very biological innovations happening on land specifically, the rise of forests.
The plants again. How could forests cause a mass extinction in the ocean?
It sounds counterintuitive, right? But the leading explanation is often called the Devonian plant hypothesis. The idea is that the very success of these first forests had unintended global consequences. Those new, deep, powerful root systems didn't just anchor the trees, they dramatically accelerated the chemical weathering of rocks on land.
Okay, breaking down rocks faster.
Much faster. And this weathering process released a massive flood of nutrients, particularly phosphorus, from the land into rivers, which then flowed into the oceans.
Ah, like dumping fertilizer into the sea.
Exactly. A huge planetary scale fertilization event. This sudden nutrient enrichment would have triggered enormous algal blooms in the shallow seas, a process we call eutrophication.
Like the algal blooms we see today from farm runoff, but way bigger.
On a potentially global scale, yeah. And just like today, when these massive blooms died and sank to the seafloor, their decomposition by bacteria consumed vast amounts of dissolved oxygen in the water.
Creating dead zones.
Precisely. Widespread anoxic dead zones would have formed, suffocating bottom-dwelling marine life that couldn't escape. And we find strong geological evidence for this. Widespread layers of black, organic-rich shale deposited during this time, indicating oxygen-poor conditions.
Wow. So the greening of the land led to the blackening of the seas, essentially. Were there other factors? Did the plants cause anything else?
Yes, potentially. That same process of accelerated weathering, combined with the huge increase in photosynthesis from all those new forests pulling CO2 out of the air to build wood,
Would have drawn down atmospheric CO2 levels.
Exactly. Significantly. Since CO2 is a potent greenhouse gas, removing so much of it likely led to a period of global cooling, maybe even triggering glaciation in polar regions. This cooling and the associated sea level fluctuations would have put additional stress on marine ecosystems, especially those warm water tropical reefs.
So nutrient pollution, anoxia, and global cooling all potentially linked back to the success of forests.
Yeah.
Anything else in the mix?
Other factors were almost certainly involved too. We know there was large-scale volcanic activity around this time associated with the Vilyu traps in Siberia. These eruptions could have released climate-altering gases, contributing perhaps to both short-term cooling via aerosols and long-term warming via CO2, as well as releasing heavy metals into the environment. It's most likely that anoxia, cooling, sea level changes, and volcanism all interacted in a complex and destructive way. There isn't one single smoking gun.
A tangled web of environmental pressures then. What did the ecological collapse look like? Who were the main victims this time?
The late Devonian extinctions were overwhelmingly a marine crisis. Life on land, including those new forests and the very early land vertebrates that were just emerging, seems to have been much less affected.
Okay, so the oceans took the hit, especially the tropics.
Yes, the crisis was most severe in the warm, shallow tropical seas, which had been the absolute hotspots of Devonian biodiversity. The overall death toll was staggering estimates, suggest around 70–80% of all animal species disappeared over the course of the crisis.
And the most spectacular victims.
Were undoubtedly the planet's magnificent reef ecosystems. Those massive Devonian reefs built by the stromatoporoid sponges and the tabulate and rugose corals were almost completely wiped out, particularly by the Kelbasser event. This ecological collapse was so profound, so complete, that major reef building by similar types of organisms didn't really recover for over 100 million years, well into the Mesozoic era.
100 million years without major reefs. That's almost unimaginable.
It speaks to the scale of the devastation. Other bottom-dwelling groups were also hit incredibly hard. Many types of brachiopods suffered massive losses, and trilobites, which had already been declining, took another major blow, with several major groups disappearing entirely.
What about the age of fishes? How do they fare?
Not well. In the water column, the dominant vertebrate predators were annihilated. The Hengenberg event at the very end of the Devonian saw the complete extinction of the placoderms, those amazing armored fishes, including Dunkleosteus, gone forever.
Wow.
Other primitive fish groups, like the jawless ostracoderms, were decimated, and important invertebrate groups like the conodonts, which are used to date rocks, also suffered huge losses. The extinction acted like a very strong filter. It selectively removed species that were specialized, particularly those adapted to the warm, oxygen-rich, nutrient-poor conditions of the tropical reefs. Generalists tended to fare better.
And the evolutionary consequences. How did this long, drawn-out crisis reshape life moving forward?
It fundamentally restructured marine ecosystems for the rest of the Paleozoic. The permanent collapse of those complex reef systems changed the very nature of the seafloor environment. And the extinction of the placoderms and many other early fish groups created this huge ecological vacuum in the seas.
An empty space at the top of the food chain.
Exactly. And this cleared the way for the survivors, notably the early sharks, or chondrichthyans, and the bony fishes, or osteichthyans, to undergo a major adaptive radiation in the following period, the Carboniferous. They diversified rapidly, filling those empty niches and establishing the lineages that dominate the oceans today.
So the end of the age of placoderms paved the way for the age of sharks and modern fish.
In essence, yes. And while it was primarily marine, the crisis likely had indirect effects on land, too. It occurred right at this critical time when the very first four-limbed vertebrates, the tetrapods, were just starting to explore terrestrial environments. Some key transitional lobe-finned fish, potential ancestors or close relatives like Tiktaalik, seemed to disappear around the Frasnian-Femmenian boundary. By altering coastal and freshwater habitats, the extinction pulses likely influenced the environmental pressures and ecological opportunities facing these early land pioneers, perhaps shaping the subsequent course of terrestrial vertebrate evolution in ways we're still trying to understand.
So the core insight here seems to be the incredible interconnectedness. A biological innovation on land forests unintentionally destabilizes the entire ocean system through nutrient runoff, oxygen depletion, and climate change, leading to a prolonged multi-stage collapse.
That interconnectedness of Earth systems is absolutely a key takeaway from the Devonian crisis. Actions in one sphere have profound, often unexpected consequences in others.
Okay, now we arrive at the big one. The event our sources call the Great Dying, the end Permian extinction about 252 million years ago. This is consistently ranked as the most severe mass extinction in Earth's history, the closest life ever came to being completely wiped out. What was the world like just before this ultimate catastrophe hit? Life on the precipice of Pangaea.
Yeah, the late Permian world was really a world of extremes, largely because of its geography. By this time, nearly all of Earth's major land masses had drifted together and fused into the colossal supercontinent Pangaea.
The giant C-shaped continent.
Exactly, stretching nearly from pole to pole. This enormous landmass created a very harsh continental climate over much of its interior. Think intense seasonality, huge temperature swings between summer and winter, and vast arid deserts.
Sounds tough. What kind of life managed to thrive there?
Despite the harsh conditions, life on land was actually quite complex and diverse. But the dominant terrestrial vertebrates were not dinosaurs, yet they wouldn't arrive for millions of years. Instead, the top roles were held by synapsids.
Synapsids. Those are the mammal-like reptiles,
Yeah.
the group that eventually led to us.
That's the lineage, yes. They occupied a huge range of ecological niches in the Permian. You had large herbivores, like the dicynodonts, some looking a bit like tusked hippos, and you had fearsome predators, like the gorgonoxins, some of which had massive saber teeth. And crucially, among the synapsids were the cynodonts, a group that was becoming increasingly mammal-like and includes the direct ancestors of all mammals.
So our distant ancestors were major players. What about the other main reptile line, the one leading to dinosaurs and crocodiles?
The sauropsids. They were around, but generally they were a more subdued component of these ecosystems, living somewhat in the shadow of the dominant synapsids.
Okay. And the oceans. Had they recovered from the Devonian?
Oh yes, the oceans were rich and diverse again. Marine life had fully recovered and rediversified. You had reefs again, though built by different organisms than in the Devonian, things like sponges, algae, and brachiopods. Lots of brachiopods, mollusks, sea lilies called crinoids. And interestingly, the very last of the trilobites were still clicking on in Permian seas. It was really a mature, complex Paleozoic world, totally unaware of the almost complete annihilation that was about to occur.
A mature world on the brink. What triggered it? What was the perfect storm that caused the great dying? Our sources seem to point very clearly to one specific, and by now familiar, type of culprit.
Indeed. The scientific consensus on the end Permian is remarkably strong now, and it points overwhelmingly to the eruption of the Siberian traps as the primary driver.
Another LIP. A large igneous province, like the ones potentially involved in the Devonian.
Exactly, but on an even more monstrous scale. This wasn't just a single volcano, it was a vast region in what's now Siberia, where stupendous volumes of basaltic lava erupted from giant fissures in the Earth's crust over a relatively short geological time. The eruptions covered an area larger than Western Europe with lava, sometimes kilometers thick.
Incredible. But again, like we discussed before, it probably wasn't just the lava itself that was the main killer.
Correct. The sheer volume of lava was immense, but the truly lethal aspect was the colossal quantity of gas released into the atmosphere. And crucially, the Siberian traps magma didn't just erupt onto the surface. It burned its way up through vast underground deposits of coal and organic-rich sedimentary rocks.
Oh, so it cooked the ground and released even more gas.
Precisely. It unleashed this torrent of carbon dioxide, CO2, and methane, CH4, two incredibly potent greenhouse gases, far beyond what the magma itself contained. Atmospheric CO2 levels are thought to have skyrocketed, maybe from a baseline of around 400 parts per million, similar to pre-industrial levels, up to over 2,500 ppm, possibly even higher. A staggering increase in a very short time.
Okay, a massive, rapid injection of greenhouse gases. How did that then trigger what sources call a cascade of catastrophes that seem to attack life on literally every front?
It created this deadly synergistic environmental collapse. First, and most obviously, that huge injection of greenhouse gases caused runaway global warming. Global average temperatures soared, potentially by 5 to 8 degrees Celsius overall, but maybe even more dramatically in certain regions. Tropical ocean surface temperatures might have risen by a truly shocking 8-10 degrees C, reaching lethal levels for many organisms.
Lethal heat. Okay, what was next in the cascade?
Second, as the oceans warmed, they started to lose their ability to hold dissolved oxygen. Warmer water simply holds less gas. Plus, the warmer surface waters became much less dense than the colder deep waters, effectively putting a lid on the ocean and shutting down the normal ocean circulation patterns that transport oxygen from the surface to the deep sea.
So the oceans suffocated.
Large parts of them did, yes. The oceans are estimated to have lost maybe 80% of their dissolved oxygen, becoming vast oxygen-depleted or anoxic zones. And in these suffocating waters, certain types of anaerobic bacteria thrived bacteria that don't need oxygen and instead use sulfate for respiration.
And they produce?
They produce highly toxic hydrogen sulfide gas, H2S, the stuff that smells like rotten eggs. This turned large parts of the deep ocean and maybe even shallower waters into a poisonous euxinic soup. Some climate models even suggest that so much H2S was produced that it eventually bubbled out of the ocean and into the atmosphere, directly poisoning life on land as well.
Oh my God. So extreme heat, no oxygen, and toxic gas filling the oceans and maybe the air. What else? Was there more?
Unfortunately, yes. Third, that immense amount of CO2 dissolving from the atmosphere into the seawater formed carbonic acid, which dramatically lowered the ocean's pH. This is ocean acidification.
Like we're seeing today, but much faster and more extreme.
Much, much faster and more extreme. This made it incredibly difficult or even impossible for many marine organisms like corals, mollusks, plankton to build their shells and skeletons made of calcium carbonate. Their building blocks essentially dissolved or couldn't form.
So their homes and bodies disintegrated.
Effectively, yes. And fourth, there's evidence suggesting the volcanic eruptions also released halogen-bearing gases like chlorine and fluorine compounds, which reached the stratosphere and damaged Earth's protective ozone layer. Fossil plant spores from the Permian-Triassic boundary show high rates of mutation, suggesting that life on the surface was being bombarded by harmful ultraviolet radiation from the sun.
It's an assault from every possible direction. Heat, suffocation, poison, acid, radiation.
Exactly. It was this lethal synergy. Think
Yeah.
about it from an organism's perspective. The heat increases your metabolic rate, meaning you need more oxygen, but the oxygen is disappearing. The water you live in might be turning acidic and poisonous. It was a devastating physiological trap. This multi-pronged, rapid environmental collapse is why the end Permian was the most severe extinction event we know of.
The greatest biological annihilation. The sources use that phrase. Just how extensive was the devastation? What were the numbers?
The scale is truly mind-boggling, almost defying comprehension. This was by far the closest life has ever come to being completely extinguished since the advent of complex animals. The best estimate suggests that somewhere between 90% and 96% of all marine species went extinct.
96%.
And around 70% of terrestrial vertebrate species, the land animals, were wiped out. If you look at higher taxonomic levels, something like 57% of all biological families and a staggering 83% of all genera vanished from the face of the Earth.
It's hard to even imagine. Was any group spared?
Pretty much no group was spared significant losses. In the oceans, the last few species of trilobites, a group that had dominated Paleozoic seas for over 250 million years, finally met their end. Gone forever. The great Paleozoic reef ecosystems built by rugose and tabulate corals, sponges, and other organisms were completely destroyed and wouldn't recover for millions of years. Other dominant invertebrate groups like brachiopods, crinoids, coeloles, and bryozoans suffered catastrophic losses.
And on land, what happened to the ruling synapsids, our distant relatives?
They were decimated. The dominant synapsid groups, the large herbivores and predators like the Gorgonopsians, were essentially wiped out. The forests also died off on a massive scale. We see this in the rock record as a coal gap, a period of several million years in the early Triassic where virtually no coal was deposited anywhere on Earth simply because the planet's forests had vanished.
Wow. Even insects.
Yes, it's also recognized as the largest known mass extinction of insects in Earth's history. It truly was a near-total reset of the biosphere.
A world reset. What was the recovery like? How long did it take? And how did this catastrophe fundamentally change the course of evolution?
The recovery was agonizingly slow, much slower than after other mass extinctions. It took many millions of years, maybe 5 to 10 million years or even longer, for ecosystems to begin to rebuild complexity and for biodiversity to start climbing back towards pre-extinction levels.
What did the immediate aftermath look like? The early Triassic world.
It was a strange and desolate place, often described as a disaster ecosystem. On land, ecosystems were dominated by just a few hardy, opportunistic survivors. The most famous of these is Lystrosaurus.
Ah, yes, the sources mention that one, a synapsid survivor.
Yes, a pig-sized herbivorous dicynodont synapsid. Fossils of Lystrosaurus are incredibly abundant in early Triassic rocks across Pangaea, sometimes counting for 70, 80, even 90% of all terrestrial vertebrate fossils found from that time. Its sheer abundance tells you how empty the world was, how few competitors it had.
A world dominated by one type of hardy survivor. What about the oceans?
In the oceans, the collapse of complex ecosystems and the lack of grazers allowed simple microbial mats, layers of bacteria and algae to flourish on the seafloor, something not seen on such a scale since before the Cambrian explosion. It was like the clock had been turned back hundreds of millions of years in some ways.
So a very long, slow recovery from a desolate world. But eventually, life did recover. What were the huge evolutionary consequences of nearly wiping the slate clean?
Monumental. The near-total annihilation of the previously dominant synapsid groups on land created this vast ecological vacuum. All those niches for large herbivores and carnivores were suddenly empty. This was the single most important factor that allowed the previously marginal sauropsid reptiles, the other main branch of reptiles, to finally seize their chance.
The ones that had been in the shadows during the Permian.
Exactly. In the long, slow recovery period of the Triassic, it was one particular group of sauropsids, the archosaurs, the ruling reptiles that diversified most successfully, radiating into the empty niches.
And the archosaurs include?
This initial Triassic radiation of archosaurs would ultimately give rise to crocodiles and their relatives, the flying pterosaurs, and, most consequentially for the next 150 million years, the dinosaurs.
Ah, so the Great Dying. by wiping out the dominant synapsids, indirectly paved the way for the rise of the dinosaurs.
Absolutely. It fundamentally reset the course of terrestrial vertebrate evolution. Without the end Permian extinction, the world might have remained dominated by synapsids, and maybe mammals would have evolved much earlier, or dinosaurs might never have gotten their chance. It truly set the stage for the Mesozoic era, the age of reptiles.
So the profound insight from the end Permian seems to be the sheer destructive power of massive, rapid disruptions to the global carbon cycle, primarily driven by extreme volcanism interacting with Earth's geology. It can unleash this synergistic cascade of horrors, warming, anoxia, acidification that pushes life to the absolute brink and takes millions upon millions of years to recover from, completely changing the evolutionary trajectory.
It's the starkest reminder in the fossil record of the planet's capacity for catastrophic environmental change and just how long the scars can last.
Incredible. And that devastating reset brings us perfectly to the next major event in our timeline, the end Triassic extinction, around 201 million years ago.
How long?
Our sources describe this one very evocatively as paving the way for dinosaurs. What was this Triassic world like, this crucible of competition that emerged from the ashes of the Great Dying?
Right. So after the end Permian apocalypse, the Triassic period, which lasted about 50 million years, was this time of slow recovery and biological reconfiguration. Life gradually repopulated a world that was still largely dominated by the supercontinent Pangaea, and conditions were generally hot and arid over large areas.
And the archosaurs, the ruling reptiles that benefited from the Permian extinction, they were diversifying.
They were diversifying spectacularly, yes, filling those niches left empty by the synapsids. However, and this is crucial for understanding the end Triassic event for much of the Triassic, the most dominant and ecologically diverse of these archosaurs were not actually the dinosaurs.
Oh, who was ruling then?
Instead, the top ecological roles, the apex predators and large herbivores, were largely filled by their cousins within the archosaur group, the pseudosuchians.
Pseudosuchians.
Yeah.
That means false crocodiles. Are they related to modern crocs?
They are on the crocodile side of the archosaur family tree, yes. This diverse group included some really impressive creatures. Massive, crocodile-like phytosaurs that lived in rivers and lakes, heavily armored, plant-eating atosaurs that looked a bit like walking tanks covered in plates, and fearsome terrestrial predators called rauisuchians, some of which were huge, upright walking carnivores, the true apex predators of their time.
Wow. So where were the dinosaurs in all this?
Dinosaurs had definitely appeared by the late Triassic. We find their fossils. But the evidence suggests they were generally smaller, mostly bipedal animals, and a relatively minor component of these ecosystems. They were kind of living in the shadow of their larger, more diverse pseudosuchian relatives.
So not yet the giants we usually think of.
Not yet, no. Elsewhere, you still had some large crocodile-like amphibians called temnospondyls hanging on in freshwater habitats. And importantly, the first true mammals had evolved small, shrew-like furry creatures, probably nocturnal, already beginning their long history of living beneath the feet of the dominant reptiles. So the late Triassic was this fascinating world of intense competition between multiple thriving dynasties of reptiles and amphibians.
Okay, a complex world with dinosaurs as underdogs. So who or what broke this stalemate? What cleared the stage and truly paved the way for the dinosaurs to take over? The sources point yet again to a familiar type of geological upheaval.
A depressingly familiar culprit, yes. The scientific consensus now overwhelmingly points to another colossal flood basalt eruption event. The Central Atlantic Magmatic Province, or CAMP.
CAMP. Okay, where and what was that?
This was an enormous igneous province that formed as the supercontinent Pangaea began to literally tear apart, starting the process that would eventually open up the Atlantic Ocean basin. The volcanic activity associated with CAMP was staggering. It spewed lava and gas from fissures across vast areas that would eventually become North America, South America, Africa, and Europe.
So, geographically huge. And critically, the timing lines up with the extinction.
Perfectly. High-precision radiometric dating has become incredibly refined, and it's established an undeniable link between the onset of the CAMP eruptions and the extinction event. The initial, most massive pulses of CAMP volcanism are pinpointed to an exceptionally brief window, perhaps as short as just 40,000 years right at the Triassic-Jurassic boundary, perfectly synchronizing with the sudden collapse of ecosystems recorded in the fossil record, both in the oceans and on land.
40,000 years. Geologically, that's instantaneous, and like the Siberian traps at the end Permian, I assume it wasn't just the lava itself.
No, again, the primary kill mechanism seems to have been the immense volume of greenhouse gases injected rapidly into the atmosphere. The eruption of Canopy is thought to have quadrupled atmospheric CO2 levels, maybe even more, in that very short time frame.
And that triggered, I guess.
Exactly the same cascade of environmental effects we saw, albeit perhaps on a slightly smaller scale, at the end Permian. Rapid and intense global warming, widespread ocean anoxia as the oceans lost oxygen, and severe ocean acidification as all that CO2 devolved into the seawater. This sudden, volcanically induced climate catastrophe plunged the competitive Triassic world into a new crisis.
Okay, another climate catastrophe. How selective was this end Triassic extinction? Who were the main casualties this time? And maybe more importantly, who are the survivors who then inherited the Earth?
The end Triassic extinction was a very severe blow. Estimates suggest it wiped out maybe 76% of all species and around 20-25% of all taxonomic families. But its most remarkable feature, especially compared to the end Permian, was its high degree of selectivity. It hit some groups incredibly hard while leaving others relatively untouched.
Who got hit the hardest on land?
On land, it was devastating for the previously dominant dynasties. The diverse Pseudocetian archosaurs, the Rauciacins, the Adasaurs, the Phytosaurs were essentially wiped out. Gone. Most of the large temnospondyl amphibians also vanished. It really cleared the decks of the incumbent large land animals.
And in the oceans?
Oceanic losses were also severe. The conodonts, those eel-like creatures whose phosphatic teeth are crucial index fossils for dating rocks, were driven to final extinction after surviving the Permian crisis. Reef ecosystems collapsed again, with stony corals being particularly devastated, and many families of other marine invertebrates like brachiopods, bivalves, clams and oysters, and ammonoids, shelled relatives of squid, disappeared.
So a major clearing event, particularly among the large land animals. Who made it through this filter, seemingly by chance?
Amidst this carnage, a handful of groups passed through the extinction bottleneck relatively unscathed, or at least well enough to recover quickly. On land, the key survivors included the crocodilomorphs, the group that includes the ancestors of modern crocodiles.
Okay, they made it.
The flying pterosaurs made it through. The small, furry mammals made it through, continuing their existence in the undergrowth. And, most consequentially, for the next 150 million years, the dinosaurs made it through.
The dinosaurs survived, while their main competitors, the big pseudocetians, got wiped out.
Exactly. This is why the end Triassic extinction is often considered the single most important event in the entire evolutionary history of the dinosaurs. It wasn't the event that originated them, they were already around, but it was the event that essentially handed them the keys to the kingdom.
Their coronation, as the notes say.
It's a perfect description. By selectively eliminating virtually all of their chief competitors, the large, dominant Pseudocetian archosaurs that had kept them in check throughout the late Triassic, the extinction event completely cleared the world's terrestrial ecosystems of their incumbent rulers,
Creating a huge power vacuum.
an immense landscape of vacant ecological niches. The surviving dinosaurs, now freed from the competitive suppression they had faced, were perfectly positioned to capitalize on this unprecedented opportunity.
And they did.
Boy, did they ever. In the ecological vacuum of the following early Jurassic period, they underwent an absolutely explosive adaptive radiation. They rapidly diversified in form, they grew to enormous sizes, they spread across the globe, filling all those roles of top predators and giant herbivores that had been vacated. This contingent event, this stroke of geological luck that allowed them to survive while their competitors perished, directly ushered in the Jurassic and Cretaceous periods as the undisputed age of dinosaurs. It wasn't necessarily that they were inherently superior in the Triassic world, it was that they were lucky enough to survive the crisis.
So the core insight from the end Triassic seems to be about contingency and opportunity in evolution. It highlights how evolutionary success isn't always about being the best in a stable world. Sometimes it's simply about having the characteristics or maybe just the luck to survive a sudden environmental catastrophe and then being able to exploit the unprecedented ecological opportunities that arise from the ashes.
It's a powerful illustration of how chance events, geological catastrophes, can completely reroute the river of evolution.
A true turning point for life on Earth, leading directly to the age of dinosaurs.
Oh.
Okay, let's fast forward now through the Jurassic and most of the Cretaceous, about 135 million years, to the next and perhaps the most famous, mass extinction. The end Cretaceous event, about 66 million years ago. This is the one everyone knows, right? The asteroid and the end of the dinosaurs. Yeah. What was the world like just before this final cataclysmic event of the Mesozoic era?
Right, the final chapter of the Mesozoic, the late Cretaceous period, was a really vibrant, dynamic greenhouse world. It was generally warm, sea levels were high again, flooding continents, and life was incredibly diverse, both familiar in some ways and totally alien in others.
And on land, this was peak dinosaur, wasn't it?
Absolutely. The non-avian dinosaurs were at the zenith of their 150 million year reign. Ecosystems across the globe were populated by a truly spectacular menagerie. You had the icons like the colossal predator Tyrannosaurus rex in North America, the heavily armored ankylosaurs, the three-horned triceratops, and vast herds of duck-billed hadrosaurs. It was an incredibly diverse fauna.
What else was happening on land? Weren't plants changing too?
Yes, a major botanical revolution had occurred during the Cretaceous. Flowering plants, the angiosperms, had evolved and undergone a huge diversification, spreading globally. They were co-evolving in intricate relationships with pollinating insects, changing the face of terrestrial ecosystems.
So a world dominated by iconic dinosaurs and newly evolved flowering plants. What about the skies and the seas?
The skies were still patrolled by the last of the pterosaurs, some of which were absolutely enormous, like Quetzalcoatlus, with wingspans like small airplanes. And the oceans were dominated by their own caste of reptilian giants, powerful predatory marine lizards called mosasaurs, some reaching sizes comparable to large whales, and the long-necked plesiosaur.
More marine reptiles.
Oh, yeah. The seas were also filled with other characteristic life forms, like the coiled-shelled ammonites, relatives of modern squid and octopus, which were incredibly abundant and diverse. You had diverse fish faunas, and in shallow tropical seas, strange reef-building clams called rudists formed massive structures. And all the while, our own ancestors, the mammals, though they had diversified somewhat, remained mostly small, generally shrew to badger-sized creatures, living a largely nocturnal existence, still very much in the shadow of the ruling dinosaurs. It seemed like a stable, mature, secure, global ecosystem that had been in place for tens of millions of years. It seemed stable, but clearly wasn't destined to last. Okay, our sources describe this end Cretaceous event as the quintessential example of that press pulse model we talked about earlier. Can you break that down for us? What was the long-term press stressing the system, and what was the sudden catastrophic pulse?
Okay, yeah, it fits that model really well. The press, the long-term stressors, seems to have come in the form of another period of colossal and sustained volcanic activity. This time, it was the Deccan Traps in what is now modern-day India.
Another massive flood basalt province, like Siberia and Campi.
Exactly. A huge area was covered in lava flows. And critically, these eruptions were spewing lava and, more importantly, climate-altering gases like CO2 and sulfur dioxide for hundreds of thousands of years leading up to the very end of the Cretaceous period. While the scientific consensus now is pretty firm that this volcanism was not the ultimate primary cause of the extinction.
It wasn't the killer blow itself. Probably not the final killer blow, no. But it would have placed global ecosystems under significant stress. Imagine decades or centuries of volcanic haze, acid rain, maybe short-term cooling spells, followed by longer-term warming from the CO2. This likely weakened the resilience of ecosystems, made them more fragile, more vulnerable to the immense shock that was about to hit. So that's the press.
Okay, a stressed planet. And then came the pulse. This is the part most people associate with the end of the dinosaurs, right? The giant asteroid.
That's right. The pulse was an event of almost unimaginable violence and energy. The impact of a massive asteroid or possibly a comet, estimated to have been somewhere between 10 and 15 kilometers wide. That's roughly the size of Mount Everest.
That big. Where did it hit?
It slammed into the planet at the site of the modern Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, creating the 180-kilometer-wide Chicxulub crater, which is mostly buried today offshore and under sediments. The collision released an amount of energy that's just staggering to contemplate, estimated to be equivalent to over 1 billion Hiroshima atomic bombs going off simultaneously.
1 billion Hiroshimas. That's inconceivable. What were the immediate effects?
Globally catastrophic and multifaceted. The initial blast wave and an intense thermal pulse, a wave of heat, would have incinerated everything for thousands of kilometers around the impact site almost instantly. The impact triggered earthquakes of unimaginable magnitude, far larger than any ever recorded by humans, shaking the entire planet. It also generated colossal mega tsunamis, hundreds of meters high, that raced across the world's oceans, inundating coastlines thousands of kilometers away.
Fires, too. I remember reading about fires.
Yes. Huge amounts of superheated rock and molten droplets ejecta were blasted high into the atmosphere, even into space on ballistic trajectories. As this material rained back down all over the globe, friction heated it to red-hot temperatures, igniting continent-spanning wildfires. There's a layer of soot found globally right at the boundary layer, testifying to this worldwide firestorm.
Horrifying. Just nightmarish immediate effects. But the sources say the most devastating kill mechanism, the one that really caused the global collapse, was the longer-term atmospheric effect. What exactly happened there?
This is what really sealed the fate for so many species worldwide. The impact didn't just throw up hot ejecta. It blasted trillions of tons of pulverized rock dust, soot from the wildfires, and crucially, sulfur aerosols from vaporized sulfate-rich rocks at the impact site, high into the stratosphere.
Okay, so the upper atmosphere filled with dust and sulfur.
Exactly. This formed a dense shroud of debris that enveloped the entire planet, probably within hours or days. This shroud blocked sunlight, maybe reducing it to twilight levels or even less, for years, perhaps even decades.
Blocking the sun, so an impact winter.
Precisely, a severe and prolonged global impact winter. Global temperatures plummeted dramatically, but even more critically, the lack of sunlight shut down photosynthesis, both on land and in the surface waters of the oceans where phytoplankton live.
The base of the food web collapses.
Completely. The collapse of the photosynthetic base led to the starvation of herbivores and then the carnivores that fed on them. It was a cascading food web collapse. Furthermore, that vaporization of sulfur-rich rocks at the impact site led to the formation of vast amounts of sulfuric acid in the atmosphere. This fell back to Earth as devastating acid rain, poisoning soils and freshwater ecosystems, and significantly acidifying the surface layers of the oceans, harming organisms with calcium carbonate shells like plankton and mollusks.
So darkness, cold, starvation, acid rain, combined with a planet already stressed by the Deccan volcanism.
It was the perfect storm, the ultimate press-pulse event, delivering a swift and brutal blow to life across the globe.
A truly swift and brutal end to an entire era, the Mesozoic. What was the final toll? Who were the most famous casualties, and what about some of the lesser-known but still significant losses?
The end Cretaceous extinction event, often called the KPG extinction for Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary, was incredibly rapid and wiped out an estimated 75% of all species on the planet.
75% again. Seems like the benchmark for a major mass extinction.
It does seem to be around that threshold, yes. The most famous casualties were, of course, all of the non-avian dinosaurs. After ruling the planet for 150 million years, they vanished completely from the fossil record above that boundary layer. Gone. Their flying relatives, the pterosaurs, which had already been declining somewhat, also met their final end.
And the giant marine reptiles, the mosasaurs and plesiosaurs.
Them, too. Completely wiped out. The ocean suffered immense losses. The ammonites, those incredibly successful shelled cephalopods that had thrived in myriad forms for over 300 million years, were utterly annihilated. The peculiar reef-building rudis clams, which had formed massive structures in Cretaceous seas, also went extinct. And the base of the marine food web was shattered by the loss of many species of phytoplankton and zooplankton.
It really sounds like almost nothing large or specialized was spared. But some things obviously did survive, otherwise we wouldn't be here. Were there clear patterns to who made it through and who didn't?
Yes, survival patterns were highly selective, and they give us clues about the killing mechanisms. On land, body size was a major factor. With very few exceptions, it seems no tetrapod, no four-limbed vertebrate weighing more than about 25 kilograms, or roughly 55 pounds, survived the event.
Wow, a size threshold for survival. Why?
It likely favored animals that could find shelter more easily from the immediate effects, the heat pulse, the fires, the initial chaos. Burrowing underground or seeking refuge in water, like crocodiles and turtles did, would have offered significant protection. Smaller animals also generally require less food, which would be critical during the impact winter when primary productivity collapsed.
Makes sense. What about diet? Did that matter?
Hugely important. It seems organisms that were part of detritus-based food webs ecosystems based on feeding on decaying organic matter, like you find in freshwater streams, rivers, lakes, and soils, fared much, much better than those directly dependent on living plants.
Ah, because the plants died off in the darkness, but the dead stuff remained.
Exactly. There was likely a huge pulse of dead organic matter washing into rivers and soils. So animals that could eat insects, worms, fungi, or decaying plant and animal matter had a food source when the green world temporarily vanished. This helps explain the remarkable survival of many small mammals, many birds, especially ground-dwelling ones, turtles, crocodiles, lizards, snakes, and amphibians. They could shelter, and they could find something to eat in the devastated landscape.
Okay, so small size, shelter-seeking ability, and a non-plant-based diet were key survival traits. And this selective survival leads directly to one of the most profound evolutionary consequences in Earth history, the rise of the modern world, the age of mammals. How did this ultimate catastrophe pave the way for us, essentially?
The extinction of the non-avian dinosaurs was arguably the pivotal moment in the entire 200 million year evolutionary history of mammals up to that point. As we said, for 150 million years during the Mesozoic, mammals had been ecologically suppressed. Their size, their diversity, their ecological roles were heavily constrained by the overwhelming dominance of the dinosaurs.
Living in the niches the dinosaurs didn't occupy.
Exactly. The KPG impact event completely wiped the slate clean. It removed the incumbent rulers of virtually all medium to large terrestrial vertebrate niches across the globe in a geological instant. This created a world of immense, unprecedented ecological opportunity for the mammals that survived.
And they took that opportunity.
They absolutely seized it. In the aftermath of the extinction during the Paleocene epoch, which followed the Cretaceous, the surviving mammals underwent one of the most explosive adaptive radiations in the history of life. Freed from the competition and predation pressure of the dinosaurs, they rapidly diversified to fill that vast array of ecological niches that were now suddenly vacant.
What kind of mammals evolved then?
Over the next few million years, which is rapid in evolutionary terms, they evolved into a stunning variety of new forms. We see the origins or early diversification of many modern mammal groups appearing relatively quickly in the fossil record. The ancestors of rodents, primates, our own group, carnivorans, dogs and cats, ungulates, hoofed mammals like horses and cattle, bats, even the earliest ancestors of whales adapting back to the water. It was an incredible burst of evolutionary creativity.
And birds. They're dinosaurs too, technically. How did they fare?
Right, the avian dinosaurs. The lineage that led to modern birds did survive, likely because some were small, possibly ground-dwelling, and perhaps had diets less reliant on fresh vegetation. They also radiated dramatically after the extinction, diversifying into the more than 10,000 species of birds we see today. So 2 dinosaur lineages technically survived, but one, birds, diversified massively, while the other, all the non-avian ones, vanished completely.
So the end-Cretaceous extinction didn't just end the Mesozoic era. It directly cleared the path for the Cenozoic era, the age of mammals, and, many millions of years down the line, ultimately for the evolution of humankind itself.
Precisely. Our existence today is, in a very real sense, a direct consequence of that asteroid impact 66 million years ago.
So the core insight from the KPG event is maybe the sheer power of a single rapid and overwhelming pulse event in this case, an extraterrestrial impact, to utterly and instantly reshape life's trajectory on a global scale. It led to a dramatic, almost overnight change in the dominant forms of life on Earth. A stark reminder of our planet's vulnerability to cosmic events, but also of life's ability to rebound and radiate in completely new directions after catastrophe. It's the ultimate example of the pulse causing a complete regime shift in the biosphere, and how contingency, a chance event, can define the next 100 million years of evolution. What an incredible journey through deep time, witnessing these planetary upheavals and rebirths. Okay, let's bring this whole discussion right up to the present day, because our sources are quite clear, aren't they? They state that Earth is now passing through its 6th major mass extinction event, sometimes called the Holocene extinction or the Anthropocene extinction. But this one is fundamentally different from the Big Five. How is it being defined, and what makes it so unique, and frankly, so alarming?
Yeah, this is where the story becomes incredibly immediate and deeply concerning. The current biodiversity crisis, the 6th mass extinction, is fundamentally different in its cause. Whereas all the previous great extinctions we've discussed were triggered by massive geological events like volcanism or extraterrestrial impacts or natural, albeit sometimes rapid, climate shifts.
Right, non-biological triggers, mostly.
Mostly, yes. Although the Devonian had that plant connection. But the current event is being driven almost exclusively by the activities of a single species. Homo sapiens. That's what makes it the Anthropocene the extinction event caused by humans.
And it's not just something that started with, say, the Industrial Revolution. The roots go deeper.
They do. The sources point out that the first wave of clearly human-driven extinctions began much earlier, during the late Pleistocene epoch, maybe 50,000 to 10,000 years ago. As modern humans spread out of Africa and across the globe, colonizing new continents and islands.
Their arrival often coincided with the disappearance of large animals.
Very closely coincided, yes. With the disappearance of a huge proportion of the world's large-bodied animals, the so-called megafauna, things like mammoths and mastodons, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, giant kangaroos in Australia, moas in New Zealand, the list is long. While climate change at the end of the Ice Age certainly played a role, the timing and patterns strongly implicate human hunting pressure on animals that had never encountered sophisticated cooperative hunters before.
So that was like a prelude.
A tragic prelude, yes, to the far more pervasive and rapidly accelerating biodiversity loss that characterizes the modern era, especially the last few centuries and decades.
So we're not just passive observers of this extinction. We are quite literally the asteroid this time. What are the specific drivers? What aspects of human activity are causing this modern crisis? It seems like a multi-pronged assault.
It absolutely is. It's not one single cause, but a synergistic assault on the biosphere, resulting from multiple, interconnected human activities. Overwhelmingly, according to most studies cited in our sources, the single greatest threat today is habitat destruction and degradation.
Just converting natural land for human use.
Exactly. The relentless conversion of natural ecosystems, forests, wetlands, grasslands, coral reefs for human purposes, primarily for agriculture, but also for urban development, infrastructure, mining, logging. Agriculture alone is estimated to have transformed something like 40% of the planet's entire ice-free land surface.
40%.
And agriculture is implicated in maybe 80–90% of global deforestation, with the expansion of pasture land for livestock and croplands grown specifically to feed that livestock being particularly potent forces of habitat destruction worldwide.
Okay, habitat loss is number one. What comes next? Beyond just clearing land, how else are we directly impacting species?
The second major driver is direct overexploitation of species. This is the harvesting of wild plants and animals at unsustainable rates, driving populations down, often towards collapse.
Like overfishing?
Industrial-scale overfishing is a huge one, which has devastated marine ecosystems globally. But it also includes commercial hunting, poaching for the illegal wildlife trade thing, elephants for ivory, rhinos for horns, tigers for traditional medicine, and even unsustainable subsistence hunting in some areas. The sheer scale of human appropriation of the planet's biological resources is staggering. One statistic that really jumped out from the notes is that the total biomass, the sheer weight of humanity today, plus the biomass of our livestock, mostly cattle and pigs, now accounts for something like 96% of the total mass of all land mammals on Earth.
Wait, say that again? Humans and our farm animals are 96%.
Roughly, yes. Meaning all the wild land mammals combined, all the elephants, deer, tigers, monkeys, bears, everything else make up only about 4% of the total mammalian biomass on land.
That's utterly sobering. It puts our dominance in stark perspective. Okay, habitat loss, overexploitation. What else is in this deadly mix? Climate change has to be in there.
Absolutely. Anthropogenic climate change is another critical and rapidly accelerating driver. The burning of fossil fuels since the Industrial Revolution has dramatically increased the concentration of greenhouse gases like CO2 and methane in the atmosphere. This is driving global warming at a rate that far exceeds most natural climate shifts seen in the geological record over comparable timescales.
And how does that impact biodiversity?
In multiple ways. It's shifting climate zones faster than many species can adapt or migrate. It's altering precipitation patterns, leading to more extreme droughts and floods. It's increasing the frequency and intensity of extreme weather events like heat waves and hurricanes. And in the oceans, it's causing warming, deoxygenation, and that familiar enemy, ocean acidification. All of these place immense stress on species and disrupt the ecosystems they depend on.
So habitat loss, overexploitation, climate change. Anything else?
Yes. Two more major drivers often cited. Pollution is a big one. This includes everything from industrial chemicals and pesticides washing into waterways, to plastic waste accumulating in oceans and soils, to excess nutrients from agriculture causing eutrophication and dead zones echoing the Devonian in a way. Right. And finally, the issue of invasive species and disease. Global trade and travel have effectively broken down the natural biogeographic barriers that kept species isolated on different continents or islands for millions of years. We transport species, accidentally or intentionally, all over the world.
And some of them cause problems when they get to new places.
Exactly. Some of these introduced species become invasive. They can outcompete native species for resources, prey on them directly if they have no natural defenses, or spread novel diseases to which native wildlife has no immunity. And crucially, these drivers don't act in isolation. They interact, they amplify one another. Climate change can help invasive species spread. Habitat fragmentation makes populations more vulnerable to disease or overhunting. It's this combined synergistic pressure that's accelerating the unraveling of the planet's biological fabric.
It really is a complex, tangled web of threats, all stemming from human activity. What about the quantitative perspective? How fast is this biological annihilation, as one source dramatically puts it, actually happening compared to the background rate or the past mass extinctions?
Yeah, biological annihilation is a term used to capture the severity of the crisis, because it goes beyond just the final act of species extinction. But looking at extinction rates first, the estimates vary, but most scientific bodies concur that the current rate of species extinction is dozens, maybe hundreds of species going extinct every single day. This is estimated to be anywhere from 100 to maybe even 10,000 times the natural background rate of extinction calculated from the fossil record.
100 to 10,000 times faster. That definitely puts it in the same league as the Big Five, doesn't it?
Absolutely. In terms of rate, we are operating on a scale comparable to or potentially even exceeding the great mass extinctions of the geological past. But the crisis is arguably even more profound than just the extinction rate suggests. That term, biological annihilation, refers to the massive ongoing loss of populations within species and the catastrophic contraction of the geographic ranges where species live, even for species that are not yet formally listed as endangered or extinct.
So it's not just the final disappearance, but the hollowing out of life everywhere, the emptying of the world.
That's a very good way to put it. The sources cite some stark data illustrating this. For instance, a landmark study published in 2017 analyzed population trends for over 27,000 species of terrestrial vertebrates, mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians. It found that nearly a third of these species are experiencing decreasing population sizes and significant shrinkage of their geographic ranges.
A third are declining.
And they looked in more detail at 177 mammal species for which they had good historical data. Every single one of those 177 species had lost at least 30% of its former geographic range, and more than 40% of them had experienced severe population declines, losing over 80% of their numbers.
80% population loss, even if they're not technically extinct yet.
Exactly. Another metric, the World Wildlife Fund's Living Planet Index, which tracks thousands of vertebrate populations around the globe, estimated that, on average, global wildlife populations declined by a staggering 69% between 1970 and 2018.
69% in less than 50 years.
Yeah. This represents this massive erosion of genetic diversity within species and a severe degradation of ecosystem health and function that happens long before the final extinction event for a species. It truly is this emptying of the world, not just the loss of its rarest jewels at the very end.
That phrase, emptying of the world, is chilling. And the sources are very clear. This isn't just an ecological tragedy or an aesthetic loss, though it is both of those things. There are direct, tangible, and growing consequences for humanity itself, right?
Absolutely crucial point. The loss of biodiversity is not just something happening out there to nature. It is a direct and growing threat to human health, human prosperity, and even human security. Our entire civilization, whether we realize it or not, is fundamentally dependent on the goods and services provided by healthy, functioning ecosystems. And we are systematically undermining those services through biodiversity loss.
How so? What are the biggest impacts on us?
Well, think about the economic and social implications first. Biodiversity underpins global food security. Pollinators, like bees and other insects, are essential for fertilizing a huge proportion of our crops. Healthy soils, teeming with microbial life, are necessary for agriculture. Natural predators help control agricultural pests. The genetic diversity found in wild relatives of crops and livestock is absolutely essential for breeding resilience against new diseases and adapting to climate change. The collapse of global fish stocks, driven by overfishing and habitat destruction, directly threatens the livelihoods and primary food source of hundreds of millions of people, especially in coastal communities.
So food security is directly linked. What about other ecosystem services?
Beyond food, think about environmental regulation. Forests and wetlands purify our air and water, they prevent soil erosion, they mitigate floods, and critically, they regulate the climate by storing vast amounts of carbon. Destroying these ecosystems not only releases that carbon, exacerbating climate change, but it also increases our vulnerability to natural disasters like floods, droughts, and landslides. Economists have tried to put a value on these free services provided by nature, and the estimates run into the tens of trillions of dollars annually, far exceeding the entire global economy. We're destroying natural capital that is essentially irreplaceable.
And connections to human health, too.
Definitely. A vast number of modern pharmaceuticals, including many life-saving drugs, were originally derived from natural compounds found in plants, animals, and microbes. As we lose biodiversity, we are effectively burning a library of potential future medicines before we've even had a chance to read the books. Furthermore, the destruction and fragmentation of natural habitats, especially deforestation, increases the contact between wildlife, livestock, and humans. This increases the risk of zoonotic diseases pathogens spilling over from animal populations into humans, potentially creating the conditions for pandemics like HIV, AIDS, Ebola, and, as the world painfully experienced, COVID-19 with their catastrophic social and economic costs.
It's all interconnected. The health of the planet and our own health.
Inextricably linked. And for many indigenous and local communities around the world, biodiversity isn't just a resource. It's deeply intertwined with their cultural identity, their spiritual well-being, their traditional knowledge systems passed down through generations. The loss of species and habitats can lead to cultural disintegration and social breakdown for these communities. And even on a broader geopolitical scale, the increasing scarcity of essential resources like clean water, fertile land, and productive fisheries, often driven or exacerbated by ecosystem degradation and climate change, can become a potent trigger for social unrest, forced migration, and even violent conflict.
So when you put it all together, the core insight from studying the Holocene extinction is that we, humanity, through this combination of habitat destruction, overexploitation, climate change, pollution, and invasive species, has become a geological force comparable to the volcanoes and asteroids of the past. We are driving a mass extinction event, and in doing so, we're actively dismantling the ecological foundations of our own civilization, all at a speed that is unprecedented in Earth's deep history.
It's a sobering realization. We are effectively the press and the pulse combined this time, and the pace is terrifyingly fast.
Okay, this has been, wow, quite a journey through Earth's dramatic history of collapse and renewal. But looking at the big picture, synthesizing everything from the Ordovician Ice Age to the Permian Great Dying, the asteroid impact, and now our own Anthropocene crisis.
Yeah.
Our sources argue that the rock record itself, this vast archive of natural experiments, offers profound and incredibly urgent lessons for us today, doesn't it?
Absolutely. When you connect all these dots, when you synthesize the research on these ancient calamities that you sent over, several powerful common threads emerge. Perhaps the most fundamental one is that the most severe extinction crises in Earth history seem inextricably linked to massive and rapid disruptions of the global carbon cycle.
The carbon cycle again and again, whether it's CO2 going up or down.
Exactly. Whether the ultimate trigger is colossal flood basalt volcanism pumping out CO2, like at the end Permian and end Triassic, or an asteroid impact vaporizing carbonate rocks and causing wildfires, releasing CO2. Or maybe even a biological innovation, like the rise of forests drawing down CO2 and causing cooling, as in the late Devonian. The disruption to the planet's carbon balance seems to be the common initiator.
And that initial disruption then sets off a familiar cascade of environmental effects.
Precisely. The result is this cascade of devastating environmental changes. And the key kill mechanisms, the actual ways life gets wiped out on a massive scale, appear again and again in the geological record across these different events.
What are those recurring killers?
We've touched on them for each event, but the big ones are rapid climate change, either extreme global warming or rapid cooling and glaciation, the widespread depletion of oxygen in the oceans, leading to anoxia, the spread of toxic sulfide-rich waters, known as euxinia, often linked to anoxia, and ocean acidification caused by excess CO2 dissolving in seawater. These seem to be the planet's ancient go-to weapons of mass destruction when its systems are pushed too far too fast.
So if we did a quick comparison, end Permian and end Triassic were primarily volcanism-driven, leading to warming, anoxia, acidification.
Check.
End Cretaceous was asteroid impact, causing impact winter, then likely warming, plus acid rain and food web collapse.
Check.
And Ordovician was glaciation-driven, causing sea level fall, cooling, then rapid sea level rise and anoxia.
Check.
And late Devonian was potentially plant-driven, causing nutrient runoff, anoxia, and cooling.
Check. The triggers vary, but the Earth system responses, particularly involving carbon, climate, and ocean chemistry, are strikingly and worryingly similar in their lethality.
And these events also keep underscoring that dual nature we discussed at the start, the immense destruction, but also the catalyst for profound evolutionary change.
Yes, that's the other major lesson that echoes through deep time. While these extinctions represent periods of almost unimaginable biological suffering and loss on a planetary scale, they are simultaneously the most powerful catalysts we know of for large-scale evolutionary innovation.
Like clearing the slate.
Exactly. The devastation of dominant, long-established groups creates these huge ecological vacuums. This provides surviving lineages, often those that were previously marginal or suppressed, with the ecological opportunity to radiate, diversify, and evolve into new forms, filling those empty niches.
Like the archosaurs after the end Permian,
The dinosaurs after the Triassic.
and mammals and birds after the end Cretaceous, leading eventually to us.
Precisely. Life's resilience over geological time is truly remarkable. It finds a way to bounce back. But, and this is a crucial but, the recovery is always agonizingly slow from a human perspective, taking millions of years, and the new world that eventually emerges is always fundamentally different from the one that was lost. Extinction rewrites the rules of the game.
Okay, which brings us to the final, and perhaps the most critical, lesson from studying these deep-time catastrophes. What is the ultimate warning the fossil record provides for us right here, right now?
The fossil record, the history written in the rocks, provides a clear, unambiguous, and frankly terrifying warning. The very same environmental changes that triggered the greatest biological catastrophes of the past specifically, rapid increases in atmospheric carbon dioxide, leading to rapid global warming, ocean acidification, and spreading ocean anoxia are happening again today.
The same pattern.
The exact same patterns are reemerging. The critical difference this time lies in the driver and, crucially, the speed. The primary cause today is not a supervolcano or an asteroid impact. It is the collective activity of a single species, humanity, primarily through the burning of fossil fuels and deforestation.
And the speed.
And the speed is warp speed compared to most past events. These changes are occurring not over tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or millions of years, but over mere decades and centuries. It's a geological instant, faster perhaps than almost anything the planet has experienced before, including the lead up to the Great Dying.
So what does this all mean if we put it in the context of that press pulse model?
It means that we, humanity, are now simultaneously acting as both the long-term press through habitat destruction, pollution, overexploitation, and the incredibly rapid pulse through greenhouse gas emissions driving climate change and ocean acidification at unprecedented rates. We have become the geological catastrophe. Hashtag tag tag outro.
The study of Earth's mass extinction events, then, is clearly not just some academic exercise digging up fossils from a long-dead past. It is the essential context, the vital backstory for understanding the profound, complex, and undeniably perilous moment in which we all find ourselves living today. So thinking about everything we've discussed, this deep history of planetary resets, what stands out most to you? How might truly grasping these ancient catastrophes and life's resilience in their wake shape how we view our own immense responsibility now as the current and uniquely powerful stewards of life on Earth? What does this deep perspective tell us about the future we're creating?